Hello, welcome to our talk. This is mostly the work of Anne in her doctoral research, but we have collaborated together in thinking through some of these pieces and continuing to think them through, and therefore our dual presence. So the questions that we wish to pose in this discussion concern really research and the ethics of vulnerability. Doing research with vulnerable persons, specifically people with intellectual disability. And secondly, the place of philosophy, if you wish, in thinking through the ethics and strategies for conducting a study with a vulnerable population. So how can philosophical considerations about the ethics of human relationships and the importance we give to the notion of vulnerability inform how we approach human subjects? And what is our responsibility in research towards the dehumanization of stigmatized groups, and what active counter-processes can we promote and foster? In a wonderful work called Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, published in 2004, Judith Butler argues eloquently that practices and objects of representation, and we argue that we include practices of research as well, engage the fundamental question of the humanity and of the dehumanization of lives. And she offers, and here's a quote, "Each of us is constituted politically in part by virtue of the social vulnerability of our bodies, as a site of desire, and physical vulnerability, as a site of a publicity at once assertive and exposed. Loss and vulnerability seem to follow from our being socially constituted bodies, attached to others, at risk of losing those attachments, exposed to others, at risk of violence by virtue of that exposure." So in proposing an ethics of vulnerability, Butler requires a redefinition of responsibility. It is a responsibility towards individual persons, certainly, but equally towards groups, collective perceptions of groups, and responses by group members to redefine their space and participation in society. So the ethical concerns touch on simultaneously the participants' personal meaning-making and the participants' responses as members of a stigmatized group, invisible, devalued, and silenced.
The work that was done in the research project that we're going to be talking about today relied heavily on the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas's concern with our ethical responsibility to the alterity of the other. Just what is our ethical responsibility, in this case in research, to the other with an intellectual disability, and other frequently understood to be so unlike ourselves as to be unknowable, and to call into question their very humanness and personhood. Engaging with Levinasian philosophy to consider how the face of the other is admitted into public representations, and how public representations efface what is for Levinas most human about the face of the other, Judith Butler writes, "When we consider the ordinary ways that we think about humanization and dehumanization, we find the assumption that those who gain representation, especially self-representation, have a better chance of being humanized, and those who have no chance to represent themselves run a great risk of being treated as less than human, regarded as less than human, or indeed not regarded as at all. The necessity of, and the right to, and even the recognition of the ability for self-representation, both personal and collective in any form, have really only very recently begun to be acknowledged for people with intellectual disabilities. This can be traced to assumptions that theirs is a biological, not a biographical life. There is no story to tell beyond that of biology. Most non-disabled interest in these bodies is typically concerned with what they have, with their diagnoses, or what they don't have, such as intelligence, reason, thought, those characteristics that are most generally understood to constitute the human. As such, there's little incentive to learn from them who they are, their ways of being, and the meanings that they may attribute to their experiences of the world. Consequent to their production as a non-viable speaking subject, they're spoken for and by non-disabled others. Non-disabled others who write away the stories, meanings, and signature of people with intellectual disabilities. Consequently, the knowledge they possess is excluded, made irrelevant, and our knowledge of them is both disabled and disabling. When we consider this from a critical disability lens, ethics then is also quite political.
Then concretely then, what will we focus on today? Again, research as a politically and philosophically informed ethical quest has both principled and technical, very mundane implications for the mechanics of the research. The choices, the ways and means of involving a group of people, what they want, what we want, what can be accomplished. So what we wish to discuss as well are the 4 points about access and engagement, what informs those actions, interviewing, and is the term interviewing adequate, appropriate, or relevant in this kind of research? Consent, and what are people consenting to? What does the meaning of informed consent mean in the context of this kind of research? And fourth, to go back to the central point about the concern of human subjects, is their wounding. Wounding in emotional terms, philosophical terms, existential terms, individually and collectively. In order to respond to these questions, this discussion needs to include considerations about reflection on an experience, on a visual presentation or a perception, and reflexivity, on the part of the participants, reflecting on the self as a member of a stigmatized group. And they wish, and one of the project's goals, to address, transmit counter messages, counter representations to a non-disabled audience.
At this point, I'm just going to briefly kind of describe the project, talk a little bit about the project. It became known as the What's Wrong with This Picture project. And this was a name given to the project by one of the participants, and one that was then wholeheartedly agreed upon by the rest. It was designed as an inclusive, arts-informed inquiry into how people with intellectual disabilities would themselves see and respond to visual representations of people so labeled. And then how they might use photography to problematize disabling representations, and thus trouble non-disabled knowing of people with intellectual disabilities. It was a project that creatively engaged with the ethics and politics of self-representation. In the first step of the project, the participants, both as a group and individually or pairs, there's all kinds of different permutations of this, they would critically engage with a selection of public photographic images of people with intellectual disabilities. These were drawn from the newspaper, charity, retail advertising, movie posters, social documentary, and photographic art. At the beginning of each meeting, I would bring a whole collection that I had pulled together, and the group themselves would make decisions about which ones they wanted to work with. With help from myself and a consultant photographer, after they had spent much time critiquing images, they would then move on to trying to figure out how they would like to visually re-image or reimagine these public photographic images, either to reflect their critique, to reflect something about the images that they wanted to focus on, or to even put forth preferred images. So this sometimes involved changing the images, and for this we used Photoshop. At other times it involved taking pictures, new pictures. These would be ones that they would determine they wanted taken. They would direct our consultant photographer to take the ones they wanted. He would take lots of pictures. They would decide which one best told the story that they wanted to tell. At other times, what happened in terms of transforming the images is that they put forth their critique by juxtaposing images, putting images in conversation with each other, right? And really kind of speaking to them by doing this to articulate particular stories, messages, or even more than one message. All of these transformed images then worked as oppositional images. Images that disrupted the more stereotypic, iconic, and dysfunctional representations of people with intellectual disabilities that the group members read in the original photographic images they were looking at. In the final step of the project, the group members determined how they would prepare the images for an exhibition. And they developed themselves, with a little bit of help from us, they developed the structure of those exhibits. They made the decision to have 3 different exhibits, each one with a different audience, having a different degree of involvement, expertise, knowledge, or relationships with people with intellectual disabilities. The first was with other people with intellectual disabilities. The second one was with people who, by their own admission, had absolutely no knowledge or experience of people with intellectual disabilities at all. And the third exhibit was with an audience for whom they all shared personal and professional relationships with other people with disabilities. So this could be siblings, parents, friends. We had a lot of professionals come out to this one. Okay? 4 people with intellectual disabilities. There we go. 4 people with intellectual disabilities worked on the project. Sam, Bob, Donna, and Robin. And it's very important to them that I name them here, that I name them everywhere I present the work. Most times they're involved in presenting the work, but now they've moved on with me into another project and have sort of kind of been there, done that, and want to work on other things, so much of this we're doing without them. But they do insist that if we do present the work, that their names are used, okay? This is their work. That's how they understand it, quite rightfully. They want that known. They are also 3 of the 4 are quite keen on having their own images at this point used, because they are quite proud of what they've done. What happened with the project, which was a very interesting thing, is that it rapidly evolved from Anne's research to our work. Okay? And they do. They rightfully claim ownership over this. Okay? What I'd like to do now is just show you a few of the images. They worked with 11 in total. I don't have time to go through all of those, but I'd like to show you a few today, show you the originals, give you a little bit of information about what their concerns were with the images, and then show you some of the transformations before we go further in terms of talking about our main subject areas. This image was drawn from the Globe and Mail, and this image became central to the entire project. This is one they would not let go of. Okay? They struggled with this on many, many, many levels. And even after my having talked to the photographer, talked to the sister of the man in the image, even after conveying to them what the intentions of the image were, they did not waver for a second in their concerns and questions and issues with this image. 4 main kind of thematic ideas came out of their work with this image. One involved care. One involved power, which they termed weightless. Another one termed being identified as other, being mistakenly identified as other. And the third one dealt very much with the conflict that they experienced, their own tensions in their lives around wanting to take pride in themselves as people with intellectual disabilities, and at the same time wanting to resist against that identification because of the pain that causes. Okay? What they did first, what I'll show you first, relates to the whole notion of care. And they referred to all of this, when talking about care, it really became very much about one person in particular, one of the group members, Bob, was really quite taken up with this. And so the first transformation I'm going to show you became known as Bob's blanket. For Bob, the man in the original was just left unattended, uncared for. There's nobody there. There's nothing there. He's in this barren environment. There's no signs of sociality, of anybody else involved in his life providing any kind of care, nurturance, or anything for this obviously quite vulnerable man, right? This was Bob's solution, was to cover him, right? And you can see how this just changes the dynamic of the image completely. For them, it conveys the fact that if nobody else does, they care. Right? They care very much for this man, right? Not only for this man as an individual, but this man as representative of all people with intellectual disabilities. And the need for all people with intellectual disabilities to have caring relationships, to have people in their lives who do care for them, care about them. Okay? And they were quite clear on the distinction. Some people need tremendous care for, all people need care about. Okay? The other one, I'm only going to give you 2 of the transformations at this point. The second transformation dealt with the tension they felt that I identified around identification of self as a person with a disability and being identified as other, as an unknowable and devalued other. And this is what they've done. Now this one, for a lot of people viewing this, is problematic, because on some level it really does appear to replicate stereotypic understandings in the sense that unless you're standing and normal, you're no good. You're not valued. But that wasn't actually what they intended. What they intended with this is that anybody with an intellectual disability, in their own right, can stand on their own 2 feet and be proud of themselves. Without the description, that's not readily apparent to people, but that's what they intended by this. Okay? This is another one they worked with. This also came from a national newspaper. This one they struggled with again, and much of this was about this question of care, and a lot of it was about being mistakenly represented. Okay? They really struggled with this notion of the wheelchair taking up so much of this picture, being foregrounded, you know, stating things like, you know, as soon as you see a wheelchair, you know, there's something wrong with someone. That's the key indicator. They were quite astute. They were really quite astute in their reading of these images. They struggled with why this picture was taken with this girl in this position. Why did they have to show it this way? Why does she have to be sprawled across the lap? One of them went so far as to say that it looks like she's just committed suicide. And then to question why the person holding her would be smiling if that were the case. They struggled with this notion of, you know, in a sense it has a very clinical feel. Right? For this particular group, and again it's only 4 of them, that doesn't figure into their own sense of self, their own identity, their own lives. Right? They know it does for others, but it doesn't for them. So they really struggled with the clinical feel. Okay? This was one of their transformations. Was to sit her up. Right? This looks much more loving to them. To them, the focus now is not on the body splayed across the lap, right? One which really points to the girl's disability, right? One that really stresses that she's not like other people. It really exacerbates this notion of her being different. In this case, the focus for them is on the hands of the caregiver around the young woman on her lap, right? Taking it out of the clinical setting was appropriate for them. They really didn't like that. They also wanted it very much in a public space. They were very concerned with the other one that it was in this room, and again, there was nobody else there. Just like the original. The man was not in a public space. He seemed to be tossed away somewhere by himself, confined. So it was very important to them to move them out of that kind of a space, right? So they put her in a park. They then paired it with this, which was one of the other images they chose to work on. This is a Benetton ad. It came from their Sunflowers campaign from a number of years ago, right? They loved this picture. They chose not to change this picture at all. Because again, it really points to this notion of being cared about. Right? They see the need for care for, but especially what they notice here is caring about. They think this woman loves this child. They think it's mom who adores her child, and they really quite like this. And by pairing it then with this, right, they feel that they're really stressing to people this need that people with intellectual disabilities need to be cared about. Okay? But the other thing they did with that, you'll get to that one later, in that they took that even a little bit further. But let me show you another original one now. This was a charity advertisement. And as you can see, the caption is "What's wrong with this picture?" A group of people with intellectual disabilities all together. This dates to the mid-'80s, so the language in it they found quite appalling, but however, noted that the language is still being used. The word retarded is throughout this. It's a word that they really struggle with. Notions, there's a sentence in here which you probably can't read, or maybe you can, something about how they don't know any better, they don't know their position in the world, they don't know that they need support. So really, really minimizing the abilities to understand the people with intellectual disabilities, all of which really, really was disturbing to the group. Okay? What they ideally wanted to do was just get rid of all of that text. Because when they looked just at the picture, what they saw was a group of people who really seemed to be happy, who seemed comfortable with each other. They noted that people were touching each other. The one woman has her hands around the little girl's waist again. So they see a group of friends who feel okay about themselves, who feel okay about being with each other. So they wanted to take the words away completely. And they wanted to pair it with their own shop. They're all friends. They started out as friends before they joined the project, and their friendship only solidified as part of the research project. So for them, it was really important to pair these together. Okay. Let me move now to the notion of engagement. Engagement in research. For people with intellectual disabilities, thinking seems to follow that as a result of their impairment, they're unable to understand themselves, nor are they able to be sensitive to, and not likely to be hurt by, the ways in which we look or stare, or to the violence of the stories or representations that we as non-disabled others tell and show about them. We don't expect them to be able to look at an image, to have an opinion, to express a comment, to value or a moral judgment on how they're being represented. We don't expect them to have knowledge about society, to notice events or situations outside of themselves. Most certainly, most of us probably wouldn't give them the ability to make associations from and to public images. We also don't expect them to be able to creatively create their own images and their own representations of themselves. Relationally, we don't expect them to be able to have a shared interest, or perhaps even to be aware of a group identity. Interpersonally, we question whether they would ever be able to exchange, discuss, listen to one another. And most importantly, we don't expect them to have the ability or the wish to make an address to the outside, to make an address to the non-disabled others, especially for the purpose of redress. The research started, and this project started quite differently. It started very much from a presumption of competence. A presumption that was conveyed to the group from the first invitation, in which in approaching a self-advocacy group and talking to them about the research, it was very much about, I don't know, you are the ones who know, and I want to learn from you, right? Being invited and taking up an invitation to participate was really no small thing for this group. They'd never before been asked for their opinion on visual representations. Typically, most of them had never ever been involved in research, right? When they are, it's only as a respondent. What was being asked of them here was much more complex than simply answering a question. So this was an engagement that recognizes people with intellectual disability as the other, not in a dehumanizing or hurtful way, but in a Levinasian sense of understanding the alterity or the uniqueness of each of us, and another who is not me. This then was not about trying to understand people with intellectual disabilities from a non-disabled perspective, nor was it about devaluing or discounting difference. On the contrary, it was about valuing this difference and opening myself up to new learning, to having my own knowledge disrupted, and to myself being hurt in the process. It was about starting from a position of unknowing. The encounter with the other, in the Levinasian sense, requires a particular form of attentiveness. An attentiveness to absolutely everything that was taking place in the research project, to what they were saying, both to me and to each other, to an attentiveness to their attempts to make meaning of what they were seeing and reading in the images, but also an attentiveness to my own attending, to what I was doing in the process as a means of trying to get it right. And that's their turn. They were really quite concerned that I'd get it right, because from their perspective, that seldom happens. What this necessitated as well was an attentiveness to what they were doing, not just what they were saying, but what they were doing, to their responses, their embodied responses to the images that they were working with, to how they looked at or away from the images, to the ways in which they held or resisted the images, and to their emotional responses not only to the images, but also to each other, to what each of them was saying, what they were feeling, what they were doing. And this was facilitated by videotaping. We videotaped all our meetings, and the group, for the most part, was fine with that, which I'll explain in a bit. Take you back to this image. In this image, as I mentioned, what they really read in the image was this loving relationship between this mother and son, right? And this, right from the first get-go, when they first picked up this image, you could see this. They would hold this image. They would pull it close. They were very, very gentle in how they worked with the image. A couple of the group members have some communication issues. So sometimes what they say is not always that reliable. Being able to go back to the videotape and listen to it again was helpful, asking them to like checking with them in terms of what they were saying. But being able to look at the videotapes and also just sort of see what they were doing with the images. They would hold us like they would actually like caress this. Just caress this image, right? I mean, that tells you so much about their response to the image. This is what they chose to kind of reflect that. So this comes back to this whole notion of care, caring for and caring about, where they say that people with disabilities, some do need a lot of care for, some need lesser amounts of care for, but to some degree we all need to be cared for. But they also talk very much about caring about, that people with intellectual disabilities need to be cared about. But the other point they wanted to make about this was that they are also quite capable of caring for and caring about. And this is how they chose to represent that. Okay? And all of which was reflected in their handling of the image. Let me go back to this one. One member of the group, who's not in the group photo that you see, Robin, Robin was the youngest member of the group and perhaps most keenly aware of the inherent dangers and potential for misuse of media. As a result, he would not let me capture his body, his face, his image in the videotaping of the meetings. He was quite fine to be part of the meetings, his voice is there, but even in those meetings, I could not include him in the screen's range. He also did not at any point allow his image to be used anywhere. Okay? Every now and then I'd see this hand float in and out of the screen, but he was certainly present, but just not visually present, and that really did for him just reflect that he was quite concerned with what might happen if his image was thrown out there. And one thing that he had very much to do with in directing, a transformation he had to do, a lot to do with, and which really speaks to that, is this. That perhaps, he even raises, perhaps there should be absolutely no representations, visual representations of people with intellectual disabilities at all. Because you can't trust how they'll be used. You can't trust that somebody will get it right and do them right. And that perhaps this is safer. Okay. Okay.
And what does interviewing mean in the context of this kind of research? Well, actually, the term interviewing really doesn't apply to this research. The research ethics people want to know what kind of procedures you do, so you have to call it something. You can't just say, well, we're just going to talk, we're going to stay there, and we're going to just feel how things develop. You've got to come up with some kind of terminology, right? So the easiest is to say interview. But this is really not an interview. These were not interviews. This was a long process of first the conversations that were mediated through the images. So people were concerned not just about responding initially to the researcher. It wasn't like an interrogation, what do you think of this or what do you think of that? It was more, take a look at this picture and what do you see? Tell me, I mean, what is it? Where does it take you? What do you see? There were very specific questions which came back over again. So it's a process of engaging with a material that doesn't give the solution to it, that has no answers except for the perceptions and the meanings that people place onto it. Right? And it's only later that there's a second layer of conversation that goes into, well, how is this connected to daily living of people you know and your own daily living? But initially, this is a new, fine, strange material that has very strong emotional responses for people. So it really happened through cycles of conversations. Initially, Anne had projected to have, one meeting per image, basically. So you would go through one image, and then you would have another discussion on another image. That made sense. But that's not the way it happened, because they became quite attached, positively and negatively, cathetically attached to the images, and they wanted to see them again, and therefore they're pairing. So they would call them back in the conversations. One image makes them think of another, by similarity or by contrast, which is a totally cognitive process, obviously. So it was a way of holding on to the process that they both co-led with Anne. They would say, well, no, today we want to go back to the other one. And that's how David took on such an important place, not only for Anne, as such a starking image, but it was the central piece for them that they always went back to. So who is leading the conversation is actually much more complex. And it's a conversation both about the response of each one to the image, because each one is asked, and you, Bob, what do you see? And you, Donna, what do you see? Because they each see something else, right? But it's also the conversations between them and how each responds to the other's response outside of Anne. And then how they respond to Anne. So it's the conversations among them and the conversations with Anne. their position in a very particular way. Okay. And so who's leading the process is quite different from what one expects of an interview. Right? So I leave you to ponder what kind of wording you would like to put on this.
Let me turn now to the question of consent. This was something that certainly in preparing the ethics submission to get this research approved, something that I certainly spent a lot of time on. Okay, and the question really was, not only just how do we meet the requirements and the concerns of the ethics review board, but it's even ethically, how would I manage consent in what I was predicting was going to be a fairly dynamic and shifting project, right? This wasn't just, as Adrienne said, a simple interview. This really wasn't even one step. There were 3 steps that involved all kinds of different tasks and different people. How does one manage consent there? Also, when you consider the fact that, this is a group that's never been asked for their opinions on public representations. I had no idea how much they knew even about the potential impact of public representations on what people know or think they know about other people, about the role of those in shaping, our constructions of groups of people, right? I didn't know what they knew in that. So how was I going to, quite ethically and carefully, structure a consent process where I had, perhaps not total, I don't know if that's ever possible, but at least as much confidence that what I was doing was as responsible as it could be. What became clear was that there were going to need to be, very many different points of consent around the process, right? Throughout the whole research project, each of the steps involved different moments of consent. And this was due to the different steps, due to not only engaging with the images and with me and with each other, but in particular thinking about the exhibits and all the people who were going to be pulled in from that, right? And the questioning and the reflection inherent in the project and my inability to know how they would respond. Would they be okay with these images? Would they really be upset with these images? I did not know what their response would be. So all of this made this notion of consent quite particular. And this was arguably, in terms of the Ethics Review Board, I had a feeling this was going to be complicated by all of those assumptions around people with intellectual disabilities and their ability to give consent. Okay? So how was that managed here? Well, it was fairly carefully thought out consent procedure. And it started right from the beginning. When I went and spoke to the self-advocates group to try to invite people to participate, I really, as much as possible, tried to talk about some of those issues there, right from the beginning, to explain to them that I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, and I didn't know exactly how they might feel about it, right? Right from the get-go, okay? And 4 people were still interested in responding. Then, before the project started, I met with each of them individually and went through the ethical consent form that we had created, which was quite lengthy. And so each of those interviews, I spent probably about an hour and a half with each of them individually. At our first meeting, we went over that again. Not like line by line, but in terms of the basic sort of, the basic ideas of what was being involved, and the notion of risk, and the notion of uncertainty in terms of what was there. The first 2 meetings we actually spent talking about things like what is research and what is the purpose of putting an image in the newspaper? What is the purpose of attaching images in a movie poster? To get a sense from them of what they understood all of those things to be, as a way of perhaps then, and what this did happen, it sort of let me then work with them in terms of talking more about potential risks, things that they might feel, anticipating some of the things that might happen by being involved in the project. And throughout the project, it really was, there was this ongoing and very frequent dialogue in terms of how are you doing? How are you feeling, right? People were being, if we're upset, it was labeling that, trying to get at that. What do you want to do with this? Where can we go with this? Do you want to keep going? Do you want to stop, right? They always had the option, obviously, of pulling out. They did not want to. They ended up being very supportive of each other and actually checking in with each other as how each other was feeling, taking over what I had been doing. But another thing that was put into place, and I think this, from my feedback, was perhaps quite important to the Ethics Review Board, is I put in a process consent form. At the beginning of each meeting, we would have a bit of a debrief of the meeting before, which would include how people felt, right? Where they were at with the process. And would set out an agenda for the day. And would set out, if necessary, and this happened at the beginning, but then kind of faded out of necessity, in terms of, you know, what were things that I could be doing or others could be doing if people became upset, right? And so every meeting we would do this, and they would actually sign it. So we have stacks of these things, because we met 1 to 3 times a week for 3 months. But I think this was actually quite useful in that they were prepared for the meeting, and over time it was like, you know, we're good with this, we can do this, we don't need this, right? We can handle this, we're fine, right? But I think that in terms of the Ethics Review Board, this was a helpful piece to add. And in doing other projects that are similar, I've used it, and it's gone over well. So if anybody's interested in that, you can just get in touch with me, and I could let you know what I've done there. Okay? The biggest part in terms of the consent, though, was really making this about them in terms of as much as possible giving them control over the situation, right? So, they, as mentioned, they could leave whenever they wanted, but they chose which images to work with. If they looked at one and it seemed really disturbing, I didn't make them use it. It was up to them which ones they chose. And they ended up, as the project started to move along, working with images that were more and more disturbing, right? They were in charge of how to transform them. They were in charge with whether to include their own images. They were in charge of the exhibits. How were they going to display this? First, whether they wanted to, and they did want to very much. They were quite proud of what they were doing. But who would they invite? Where would they have these held, right? Who was allowed, who was not allowed, right? Questions of safety. Other things happened later in terms of presenting at conferences, and they came up with questions for me to take to conference organizers to ensure that they would be safe and that the audience would be respectful. They had the control over that. They let me know what was needed, and we went from there. So I think consent, even with a group of people with intellectual disabilities, can be managed quite well, right? It involves getting to know the group a little bit, but certainly not assuming that they can't do this. Instead, just assuming that we have a responsibility to do this, and a responsibility to learn from them how best to do this, okay?
The last point is the point about wounding. You know, we said people responded very strongly, very emotionally to some of these images. And we now want to cast it in terms of wounding. And that's really the central concern of the human subjects review, is not to hurt, obviously, through research, through our own actions, the very participants whom we invite to take part in our research, and particularly research about them. And asking them, so this is not a study that started from asking them about what is their experiences. However, as you look at images and how they are represented, and images which are really quite disturbing, you know, when we think of it, and when we think there's a real person there in the image. This is not just an image for an image, there is a person there. And how do we respond to that person and the representation, the framing, the context, what's there in the image, what's missing from the image. Because they work very closely with the details of the image. And they were extremely kind of moved by the images. So what is this kind of wounding that occurs that is part and parcel of this kind of research? That occurs as part and parcel of both reflecting on the image and reflecting on, is this person a person equally situated, similarly situated, as Stephen Wells would say, similarly situated as I am. And therefore I am wounded by looking at a picture of this person. So it's a form of identification and differentiation, but also identification. And they know that is the aim of the project, is to look at pictures about people similar to them while not them. It's not photographs of their own photo albums, yes? So there are different layers of wounding, and from what Anne can talk to you about, initially they really reflected about the images themselves, you know, about how they were hurtful or not hurtful, like you go to film, right? And little by little, of course, they made a connection with themselves. And so there was a kind of looping effect, right, of this kind of wounding. And yet, you know, if there was no wounding at all, then the whole project would have been kind of, the core of the project would have been rather amiss. It would have avoided anything that it actually moves them in the pictures and how the effects of the pictures. So it wasn't just what do the pictures say, but what are the effects, the emotional effects on people who look at the pictures. People who have a disability and who can identify to various extent or who may want to reject that identification for the very reason that they feel called upon to relate to that image. And secondly, as they saw it, it was also not only a personal wounding, it was a wounding of the group as they were together looking at these images and reflecting and the differences of their responses, but still feeling very much called upon to respond as an ethical response to that representation and as a group of people. So it's both what we share in our mutual or in our collective wounding towards something that is presented to us, whether we want it or not, that exists in public space. And here we are in a small space, really looking at it in greater detail. And as you know, the more you look at a picture in greater detail, the more you see these indicators that are wounding you. It's not just a general effect by now. You can see all the details that you really cannot tolerate. And that should not be there. And how are they allowed to be there? The next kind of leg of question, which is another form of wounding. How can non-disabled people, able-bodied people, and society as a whole tolerate these images? Or tolerate doing violence to people by showing these images? So the wounding is actually quite complex. Okay? So the question is, ethically, can and should wounding be avoided? You know? Pedagogically, this is the same kind of question about should we be teaching in a way that's unsettling, and that can be unsettling. You know, unsettling in a sense to the point of wounding. And so I'll let Anne develop that much further.
From the perspective of Sam and Bob and Donna and Robin, the public images that they looked at, almost without exception, the Benetton ones were the only exception. Other than that, these public photographic representations do wound. And they wound in many ways. They wound first in terms of how they delimit non-disabled viewers' knowledge about people with intellectual disabilities, about what we know and don't know about them, and then also what we tell ourselves and tell others about them, but more importantly, what we end up then doing as a result of that knowledge, what we do to them, for them, against them, right? They also felt the images wound in that it very much can come to affect how people with intellectual disabilities view themselves, right? This whole notion of internalized ableism, right? When you see yourself being so devalued in public photographs that are all over the place, they themselves acknowledge, and this is not necessarily true for all people with intellectual disabilities, but these four said that they struggled then sometimes to separate themselves from that, right? Especially at the beginning of the project. And they also felt that they wound because they really felt this radical othering of people with disabilities that takes place in these images actively discourages non-disabled attempts to get to know people with intellectual disabilities. There's a sense that you see this image, this is what they are, not who they are, this is what they are, and they're so unlike us as to be unknowable that we're just not going to bother, right? Which then has tremendous impacts on the social life of people with intellectual disabilities. What was really interesting, thinking about, what Adrienne was talking about, wounding, and the necessity versus the avoidance of wounding, is that even though they did not only see, other people with intellectual disabilities, and see how people with intellectual disabilities were othered in the images, but also how they came to see themselves individually and as a collective represented within the images. Despite all of this, they were not destroyed by this process, right? Many times they were incredibly upset, right? They really, really struggled with a lot of what they saw. But they weren't destroyed by this. In fact, they were actually quite politicized by this, right? They have gone on to do a tremendous number of things, which I can't get into in great detail, but they've started a website, they were interviewed for the newspaper, they presented at conferences all over the place. They're now engaged in another research project. They have at least 2 more research projects already planned once this one follows, right? They're recruiting new members, they've formed themselves into a group. This research, despite being upsetting, I think if you looked at the whole scheme of what went on here, has been much more positive than it has been hurtful, okay? much more positive. And if you ask them, they will tell you the same thing, right? They have really, really felt that this has made a big difference to their lives. It doesn't mean they have more money, it doesn't mean they have better housing, it doesn't mean any of those things. But in terms of their sense of themselves, in terms of how even within their own circles they're viewed by others, it has made a difference. In the sense, especially when their picture was in the paper, they were celebrities, right? It was really, really important. And I think it was really important, and I think of one of the members in particular who carried the article around in her pocket and took it to her family, a family with whom she's been estranged for many, many years, and the difference that made in terms of just her family's viewing of her, how they came to understand her, was quite important. Right? It really hasn't changed the world. It hasn't, and they know that, but it has made a difference for them. Okay? I want to give you two examples from one of the images, two of their transformations that I think, most of them speak to this. There are two that are quite clearly articulating this idea. Going back to the United Way image, this was the first thing. They really, really want people to stop using the R word. To them, it is hate. Right? Whereas, all kinds of other social groups have been able to work to have it recognize that particular language used about them is hurtful. The blatant and flagrant kind of continuous flippant use of the word retarded, like, oh, you're so retarded, stop doing that, you're retarded. I mean, you hear it all over the place. To them, this is hate and should be understood as such, right? And so when they present this image and when they talk about this, that's what they let people know. They really want that word to go away. This is another one. Don't use our picture without permission. One of the most important things in all of the work that they did was, did anybody ever ask permission of the people in the images for their pictures to be used? To the best of our ability in trying to find out what we could about the pictures, the answer was no. We did not find a single image where it looked like the person had been asked for their consent. So this is a very, very important thing to them. Oops, there you go. The other thing that they did, which I think really speaks to their growing politicization and their growing understanding of the power of images, right? The power of images in constructing what's known about people and then what's done to people, was putting out their own images, using their own images in their presentations, right? It's in the newspaper article, they've got their own image, right? That became very, very important, laying claim to the work, laying claim to the identity of a person with an intellectual disability, and doing so as a way to challenge reductive and dehumanizing understandings, right? And to challenge the devaluation that occurs. So what happened from the research project, with all of their transformations and all of what happened since, has really indicated, to me anyway, just how their involvement with the project has really helped them to locate the source of the oppression that they experience outside of themselves. It isn't the intellectual disability that's the source of the oppression, it's how people respond to that, right? And so this whole project centers for them now on bringing awareness to an able-bodied and unaware public, the nature of hurtful representations and their effects on the lives of people with intellectual disabilities. The effects as wounds, emotional wounds upon people as individuals and as a group. So wounding, as Adrienne said, really is at the center of the project, along with counter-representations as a means of addressing non-disabled others and as a means of redress. And if the participants experience no wounding, if none of this had happened, it really is questionable then that, the changes that have occurred as a result of the project could ever have happened. Okay? So, just to conclude, in taking up a political and philosophical stance on the humanity and vulnerability of research subjects, the terms in which ethical concerns come to be expressed are quite different. And they're more expanded, much expanded from those that an ethics board typically worries about. What we have then is another kind of responsibility to the participants, to the self, and to the world of changing relations. Okay? Thank you.
I think it would be good if you could sit here.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
we can. Thank you.